Hey guys, welcome back to episode 2 of the Gas build. Before we get into it, just some feedback. So my comments last episode about the Achebe's K Future handguards, a team member at Achebe's Australia spoke to me and said that they are actually coming out with a model that fits the brake tech units. So that'll be out quite soon. So if you do want a set, maybe hold off for them, or you can modify a set like I have. Let's get into it.
So the only other thing I did before the ride was to put all the suspension settings to sport mode. Because I'm heavier than what the bike's sprung for, I know it'll be a little bit soft, so that's why I went to the sport mode. So both the fork and the shock, putting all those clickers to what the manual suggests. Now using this great moto tool to adjust my rider's sag. My wife bought this for me a few years ago, and I think it was so she would stop getting called into the shed every other week to help me measure rider's sag. And then we're off.
Alright, so a bit of feedback about what I did and didn't like about this bike in its current form.
So first on to the engine and the power delivery. Now the engine power was beautiful. It was really smooth and everything you'd want in an enduro bike. You do have to rev it to really kind of unlock that last bit of power, which I think I would want a little bit more bottom end. Now I may achieve this by changing the gearing or de-restricting the muffler, or potentially even fitting an aftermarket muffler. But also the tyre that comes with this bike is a 140, which is way too big for a 350 in my opinion. So potentially going down in tyre size to a 110 or a 120 will liven up that engine a little bit more in the bottom end. Now moving on to the suspension. If there's one thing that KTM, Huskies and Gas bikes is commonly talked about is how bad the suspension is. Now keep in mind I'm one spring rate heavier than what these forks are intended for, but these forks to me were inconsistent and unpredictable. I found the fork quite stiff and deflective in the top part of the stroke, so when we're going slow over small rocks and things like that, the fork just wouldn't settle and was just all over the shop. Now, it would handle big bumps and jumps pretty well. It was quite soft, but I am heavier than what it should be. But when I put it through multiple bumps in a row, like riding down these stepped ledges here, it would almost deflect in the mid part of the stroke, which was really scary. Now, I'm hoping that this is just due to the suspension being fresh, and after a few hours it kind of breaks in. I am also coming off some of the best forks that money can buy, so I need to keep that in mind as well. But in this current form, the fork will be getting some love from Dave at Suspension Matters. Now moving on to the back end of the bike, I thought I may struggle with the linkage shock, as the last 3 bikes I've had have all been PDS shocks, so I've kind of really gotten used to that PDS feeling. I couldn't really fault it or find anything wrong with it. Again, it was a little bit soft, but it's one spring rate too soft for my weight. But I feel like with all my attention was focused on the forks and their issues, so nothing really stood out at the back end of the bike for me. Now, the first thing I noticed is the bars felt quite tall. They were already in the rear mount holes, but I rotated the clamps around backwards, which will bring the bars 5mm back towards the rider. Now, I'm hoping this will help reduce that high-end feel, because the gas bars are quite low anyway, and the forks were 3 lines through the triple clamp, so I don't understand where that extra height feeling is coming from yet. Now, moving on to the brakes. The brakes feel really good at the lever and they're quite responsive, but they don't have much reaction at the pad. They don't have any real bite, and it's quite a weird sensation because you have this really sensitive brake at the lever, but it doesn't actually provide much bite or braking power. So hopefully this changes once the pads are a bit more broken in. Otherwise, I may try some aftermarket pads just to give it a bit more feel with the brakes. Now, the clutch on this bike is unbelievably light. It's lighter than any bike I've ever ridden. It makes the KTM 2-stroke clutches seem so heavy, so I don't know how they've achieved this, but it's really good. One of the weird things about the clutch though is I found it really difficult to find the engagement point. Because the clutch is so light, it was a bit harder to really find where that clutch is engaging. Now, ignoring those front fork issues, the chassis felt amazing. It was so easy and light to move around in the tight trees and just flick around. It was beautiful in the single trail, and I think with doing some mods to those forks or putting some other suspension on, this bike will be unbelievable to handle. My plan is to take this bike to a few of the motocross tracks as well to really see how it corners in the ruts, berms, and how it handles on the track as well as out the bush. So back in the workshop, after giving the bike a quick wash, it was just onto the first hourly checks. Now, a lot of these checks are just regular things you would do to your bike before you go out, but there are some special ones like the valve clearances and to do a service on the engine. Now, the idea behind these first services is just to drop that oil after the engine's broken in. You'll notice that there'll be a little bit more material on the plug. It's nothing really to worry about. It's quite common in a brand new engine when it's being run in and all the gears and things like that are still meshing in. Now, these run the same oil filter as the KTM model, so it's quite handy if you're coming from KTM. And same oil as most of the KTM models, which the manufacturer recommends a 10 weight 50. Now, replacing these inline fuel screens is also really important. The manual suggests every 15 hours. I normally do it every engine service, which will be 10 hours. But the more important one is to replace the filter in the tank, which at the 30-hour mark, I'll show you how to do that and where to buy the filter, but that's the really important one to me. Now, one thing that did annoy me was the location of the starter button. So I have gone and swapped the starter and the kill switch around. I kept bumping the kill switch as well in its position. So I've changed the location of that to get it out of the way and to make the starter button just easier to hit with your thumb if you do stall it. And then over on the left-hand side of the handlebars, I just rotated the switch around so it's easier to access the kill switch and the horn. I am planning on neatening these up to put a single press button for each to get rid of this big block. So keep an eye out for that.
Alright, that's it for episode 2, guys. So the next episode I'll try and give you an update after the 5-hour mark. But if you have any suggestions on any of the issues I've talked about, feel free to leave a comment, let me know. And if you would like to watch the whole raw footage of the first ride on this bike, it will be right down here. See you next episode.